Have you ever heard of George Mueller? One of the worst young men in the world became one of the best men of the world. While his mother was dying in his teenage years, he was playing cards in a tavern, and the next day he went on a drinking spree. He was ultimately imprisoned because he hadn't paid his hotel bills. Suddenly his life was changed. He was invited to a home for a prayer meeting. He'd never seen one, didn't know what it was. But after that night he said, all that I've seen in Switzerland and Germany and other countries I visited does not compare with what I've seen in that Christian home tonight. He was converted, just a youngster. He went and stayed at an orphanage run by a man called Frank and saw what was done for children without parents. He said, I'm going to do that. And in the years to come, George Mueller cared for 10,000 orphans, and he did it without asking anybody for a penny. It is estimated today that the $1.5 million that he said he got an answer to prayer would be worth $86 million today, but he asked nobody for a cent. Sometimes orphans sat down for a meal and there was no food. Then there'd be a knock at the door and Baker would say, I'm sorry, my batch of bread got a bit overcooked, would you mind? They were always cared for. 10,000 children. He built 5 orphan homes. Didn't ask anybody for a cent. $86 million poured in, the equivalent thereof. When he was older, he decided he would preach to the world. So he spent 17 years preaching. He preached to 3 million people. He preached in Australia, in Germany, twice to USA, up and down the country. What a man was George Mueller. He read his Bible, so he knew it almost by heart. He loved people. He supported missionaries like Hudson Taylor. He cared for his health. He spanned most of the 19th century, living to about 92, but he left an example that will never die because he believed in the resurrected Christ and he spoke to him every day. God help us to follow that example. But now let me talk to you about someone else, a woman. Have you heard of Fanny Crosby? She lived to 95. Born in 1820, didn't die till 1915. The most famous hymn writer of the 19th century. It is estimated she wrote 9,000 hymns. But I haven't told you the main thing. She was blind due to a medical mistake in her infancy. She was blind. Over 90 years of blindness. And when people said, doesn't it upset you about the providence of God? She said, no, it is the Lord. Because of my blindness, my memory's better. Because of my blindness, I can concentrate. Because of my blindness, I have sympathy with and from the people I address. She was a woman who had visions. They were not uncommon among Christians, especially women in the 19th century. Fanny had many of them. And she had some strange convictions that usually paid off. Once she didn't have money for rent. She prayed about it. A knock at the door. Man came in, shook her hand, left $10 in her hand and immediately left. That was exactly what she needed for rent. Another time she was lecturing, because she lectured as well as wrote hymns. She preached, she lectured, she played the harp and the organ as well as writing hymns. Once in Cincinnati, she had a strange feeling and said to the group, "I'm convinced there's a young man here who's left his mother and broken his promises. Please, would that young man come and see me at the end of the service?" And at the end of the service, a young 18-year-old came to her and said, "Do you mean me? I promised my mother I'd see her in heaven. The way I've been living, I don't see how it's possible." So Fanny talked to him and prayed with him. And when he left, there was a light in his eyes. He said, "I've met my mother's God. I will see my mother in heaven." In those days, the main printer of hymns in America was a man by the name of William Bradbury. He was a dying man when he met Fanny. He said, "Fanny, I've heard you can write hymns. I want to print them. I want to publish them. Will you do one for me so I know by the end of the week that you are what I think you are?" So she wrote one. She wrote Blessed Assurance. She wrote Pass Me Not. She wrote all the hymns you and I know so well, from worship to worship time. Bradbury was thrilled with her hymn, but not long after he died, and as she passed his casket, she broke down in tears. And then a clear voice, a mysterious voice, was heard not only by her, but by other people. "Fanny, you are to continue his work. Get off the willow. Dry your tears, Fanny. You are to continue his work." And no one knew where the voice came from. But that's exactly what she did. So here was a woman who lived to 95, who preached, lectured, wrote over 1,000 secular poems, wrote over 9,000 hymns, who knew the risen Christ, who lived for him, who spoke for him, who trusted him in her blindness. Dare I say to you that all of us are blind in some respects, but we can all be like Fanny Crosby, used of God, if we know the risen Christ. Now let me tell you of someone else. You've heard the name John Wesley. Let me give you a one-sentence description of his world. Soul extinct, stomach well alive. Every sixth office building had a gin shop underneath it in London. People lived in hovels, and people with money didn't care. They thought the poor were cattle. They thought they were only vermin. The king swore. Chaplains swore at sailors on the boats. Ministers swore from the pulpit. It was a bad world. This boy nearly died at 5 years of age. The thatched rectory belonging to his father caught fire. All the family trooped out. Mrs. Booth had about 19 children, but many of them died early. But where was Jackie? Then they realised Jackie was upstairs in a room on his own. The father started toward the stairs and they collapsed in flames. He knelt down to pray. And then they heard a little voice, Jackie's voice, from the room upstairs, looking out the window, wondering what all the fuss was about. But there was no ladder. An intelligent man stooped forward and jumped on the back of another man and reached up to Jackie, and Jackie jumped, and he was caught, and he was saved, and he changed England. He saved England from a revolution more bloody than that of France. All England was in turmoil. It was his desire to reform all of England, and especially the church, and he did. John Wesley changed the lives of more people than anyone who has ever lived except Christ and the apostles. But he wasn't converted when his life was saved. Years later, he was asked to go to Georgia in America to preach to the Indians and the settlers, but it was a fiasco. He was a legalist. He thought you had to be good to be saved. He didn't know you have to be saved to be good. So he left America with his tail between his legs. He was the most miserable man in England, but he'd seen something wonderful that made him covet. He'd met Moravian people on ship, and when there was a great storm on the way to America and it looked like the ship was sinking, all the Moravians were singing hymns. There was no fear among them. Wesley coveted that experience. When he got to England, he made contact with Peter Boller, famous Moravian, and Peter Boller challenged him. He said, "You don't have saving faith. That's what you need. Come tonight to Aldersgate Street." Well, Wesley was lonely, sad, tired. He didn't want to go. But he made the effort, and just before he left his room, reading the Bible, he came across the words, "Thou art not far from the kingdom of God." He dipped into St. Paul's Cathedral, and they heard the choir singing, "Out of the depths have I cried unto thee. Hear my cry, O Lord." Then he went to Aldersgate Street, where a man was reading from the epistles to the Romans, and he described it in his diary. Suddenly, I felt a strange warmth, and I felt I did trust in Christ and Christ alone for salvation. And an assurance was given me that he'd taken away my sins, even mine. Wesley was a new man. His conversation and his face showed a radiant happiness. He could say decades later, "I have never known what it is to be depressed for more than 15 minutes at a time. 10,000 cares are no more weight on me than 10,000 hairs of my head." What a man. Dr. Johnson said, "I don't like Wesley. He enchants you with his speech, and then he runs away to talk to some old woman." But Wesley was an apostle on horseback. He became the most known man in three kingdoms, Ireland and Scotland and England. And he rode with a loose rein so that he could study. He wrote 300 books and pamphlets. He took the most well-known devotional books, abridged them, and printed them cheaply for those that would want such things. He wrote books on health, on music, on history, but most of all on the gospel. Oh, he was hated and he was loved. He'd be preaching and people would be throwing tomatoes, eggs, decaying cabbage. One day he was in a home having a short rest when he heard a roar. A crowd was coming. The woman of the house said, "Hide, sir, hide, they're after you." "No," says Wesley, "I must stand here and we will pray." Then the door was knocked down and a crowd burst in, and Wesley marched to them and he said, "Whom have I hurt? Whom have I damaged? Who has anything against me? Speak, tell me now. Bring me your captain." So they brought their head man to Wesley. In a few minutes, the lion became a lamb. Wesley said, "Bring me 2 more of the fiercest among you." And they brought them. Men who wanted to scoop up the earth and swallow it in rage. In a few minutes' talk, they too, the lions became lambs. Wesley said, "Let me out of here." Got out and he took a chair with him. He stood on the chair and he said, "People, will you permit me to speak to you?" "Yes," they said, "speak." And he spoke to them about the love of God. And at the close, the people said, "This is a good man. We'll shed our blood for him." That sort of experience happens scores of times. But Wesley never changed. For 50 years he travelled. First sermon of the day, 5 o'clock in the morning. He began the day at 4 for devotions. He was neat, he was temperate, he was wise, he was loving. He had the gift of friendship. He had more friends among more noble women than any man in the kingdom. And he engineered a company of preachers from bakers, butchers, builders, and a few educated men. And he put his printed material in their saddlebags, so after they preached the gospel, they could distribute the written word. Wesley changed his world. Christianity was almost dead in England until Wesley. He restored the Christian faith. Today there's something like about 40 million Methodists in the world. I don't know the exact figure, but 50 years ago there were 30 million. He changed the world. You can change your world if you know that Christ is alive, that he'll never leave you or forsake you. By God's grace, we can all be Wesleys. God bless you.